We're here to talk about socionics and quadra values. Are you ready to start?
Really? I thought we were here to talk about the lemon poppy seed muffins.
No, only if you are a SI valuer, which you aren't, so sorry for your luck. So, what is a quadra in socionics?
So a quadra is a superordinate type that is the basis of the way I see socionics. And basically, us to develop the socionics with the observation that some pairs of people who appeared superficially very similar appeared to get along very well, who were mostly married, I think, and other pairs that appeared superficially the same way didn't appear to get along. From this, she developed this superordinate grouping of types called quadras, which are types themselves, which form the fundamental basis for the theory of socionics.
Okay, so there are four types of quadras, and technically this is the higher grouping of typings. So if we're talking about quadras, we could say there are four types in socionics.
Yes.
Okay.
Some people don't agree with this way of thinking, but it's exactly the way I see it, is that there are four types in socionics.
I don't see anything wrong with thinking about it that way. I think it simplifies things, which is nice. So what are the four super types? What are the four quadras?
What are they called? There are
Yes.
several naming systems. The most common naming system is alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, the first four letters of the Greek alphabet. But there are other naming conventions. If you read some of the Russian literature, especially Augusta's literature, you'll see them referred to as first, second, third, and fourth quadras. The same thing.
All right. So, yeah, I've actually seen that in some of her writings, which I didn't understand the first time I saw it. But
it's just terminology.
So alpha is the first, beta is the second, gamma is the third, and delta is the fourth, right?
Yes.
Okay. A quadra are four types that value the same elements, right? And for alpha, it's Ne, Ti, Si, and Fe.
Yes.
But specifically blocked together, Ne and Ti.
Sure. Mathematically speaking, you can view it in several ways, right? The simplest way of thinking about it is that there are two dyads, and a combination of these two dyads determines quadra. That is to say that there is as a person, you either value Si and Ne, or you value the converse, extroverted sensation and introverted intuition, and not both. And given this dyad, you fall on one side of this dyad, and then you fall on one side or the other of the rational dyad, and taking together these scales, if you will, determine quadra.
Okay, so the scale, the alpha scale is...
No, there's not alpha scale, right? Alpha is a combination of two scales, a linear combination of two scales.
Okay. A linear combination of two scales. What are these two scales again?
Right, it's whether or not you value introverted sensation or extroverted sensation, and also whether or not you value introverted logic or extroverted logic.
All right.
I only say one side of the scale for simplicity, right? That the dyads go together.
Yeah.
The valued elements go together.
Yes, and there are always two value elements that come together, and for Ne that is always Si, right?
Yes.
What are the valued elements in alpha? They're Ne and Ti.
And Si and Fe.
To value Ne and Ti, that means you do not value Fi and Se together, and you do not value Te and Ni together. So that creates a certain flavor for those types. Let's discuss.
Well, sure, but you also don't value any other combination of elements together.
Yeah.
I mean, those combinations are opposite, but I mean, I don't know. I guess there's an open question. Some people argue about how blocking works.
Yeah.
If you're an alpha type, right, then you block. Additionally, you block Ni and Te together somehow as unvalued things.
Yeah.
And well, I'm not. I don't quite know what that means. Maybe we could have a discussion about that if you're interested in that. I think set of hypotheses, but I'm not really sure what it means.
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, right.
I
So
don't
if a
know.
person values NE and TI, and then they also value SI and FE, that means there are the other 6 combinations of blocked elements together that they don't value, not just the
Yes.
ones in the opposing quadra.
But they do block together the alphas, specifically the ILE, SEI, ESC, and LII. They block together FI and SE as unvalued. So do you think that that creates? Well, they have conflicting quadras, right?
Yeah.
So what does that even mean? Do they specifically not like those things together in the other quadra? Is that why they don't get along?
No, I don't think that there's any meaning to blocking, in particular the superego elements, and indeed that the thing that you can see, um, this is a division that emphasizes. This is of course related to the way I see Model A very closely. There's basically alpha is the superordinate subdivision, right? There's the quadra, and then how do you subdivide the quadra? You could divide the quadra into the 4 constituent types. You can also divide the quadra in 3 other ways. You can have alpha extrovert and alpha introvert, the alpha NT and the alpha SF, and then the alpha rational and the alpha irrational. And the one of these 3 ways of subdividing, the one that generally is in my thinking the least is actually the division into dual pairs. And in my view, by far the most, sometimes I think about the clubs, but by far the most useful, I think, in general, and the ones that most closely resemble each other is the activator pairs, the alpha extroverts and the alpha introverts. And especially among these activator pairs, there's a difference in the expression of the unvalued elements. That is to say that the elements 4 and 7, take an alpha extrovert, then elements 4 and 7 are the introverted elements that are unvalued, which are Ni and Fi, are sort of not used at all. But the extroverted elements that are unvalued which are 3 and 8, which are in the case of the alpha extrovert, Se and Te, are treated
Partially valued. Do you like to use that
partially
term?
valued. I do use that term sometimes. They're treated differently. That's not, the best way of saying it, the most precise way of saying it, is that they're present in the individual psyche a lot of the time. Whereas
Okay.
the subdued elements, or the butt end of the inferior axis and the leading axis, are really not present at all in the psyche.
So
This is the way I see it.
just to clarify, the alpha extroverts are ESE and ILE, and these 2 types express their subdued elements in their role function and their demonstrative function, and they express these by thinking about them consciously in their psyche at times.
No, but I think that what I'm saying is right, that the demonstrative and role function, just in general for all types, are partially present in the psyche, whereas the vulnerable function and the ignoring function are not present actually at all.
Right.
Or, I mean, at all. They're present in some. They're not completely absent, but they're less present than all of the other elements.
Okay. So for the alpha extroverts, the subdued elements that would not be expressed as often would be the vulnerable and the ignoring, and for those 2 would be Fi and Ni.
Yes.
Okay. So, and this is how these 2 types can appear similarly, superficially.
Yeah, but so there's also a right, and I mean superficially and also deeply, in my view, these types really are very close to each other because they shared these this very close way of expression of all of the elements, not just these elements. The biggest difference in expression, in my view, is between elements 2 and 5, which do look somewhat different. But sometimes element 2 is not really as visible, and sometimes element 5 is more visible. There's quite a bit of variation in these elements.
So you're talking about element 2, which is the creative function. You're saying that in the let's say in the ILE, the TI would be expressed less in some of those.
Yeah, well, I think the creative function historically in Augusta's writing is described as this element of the function that is on some of the time, but not on all of the time.
Okay.
Usually as a contrast to the program function, which is on all the time. Specifically, it's emphasized the creative function is not on all the time. So
Okay.
this is not dissimilar to how I view this function, which is that its emphasis is somewhat inconsistent. And the suggestive function is not usually painted in this way in Augusta's writing. Augusta's writing, I think, doesn't treat the suggestive function in all of its glory, so to speak. But if you've read a lot of the writing I have to write about it and what the suggestive function does, I see the suggestive function as quite important to the individual. And as a facet of that importance, it has quite a wide range of expressions that usually have to do with the level of awareness the individual is able to use to tap into that area. Right, so again, it gets back to Augusta basically believed duality was magic, or at least believed that for long enough to write about it in Socionics very ardently. And her view of the way to tap into the suggestive function is essentially to get into a dual relationship and marry your dual, or something of the sort.
What you say is that function can actually be leveled up, like slowly on your own, basically.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, of course it can be leveled up, right?
Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah. That to me, that's common sense. Is that Socionics is a model essentially, and that being restricted. So some people see it as restrictive. It's not a restrictive model more than a descriptive model. What I think really is this: is that Socionics describes the suggestive function as a deep weakness which, in Augusta's formulation, is healed by this magical thing called duality. But when something is a weakness, it tends to occupy a lot of conscious attention, and
But you can
people
have
ways of dealing with this.
There are some people that would say that there's a way of expressing your suggestive in a neuroticism, whereas you're not so aware of it, and then there's a way that you can, let's say you do become more aware of it and it's less neurotic.
What is the difference between these modes of expression?
I would say one might have more experience. The neurotic suggestive function might require other people to be constantly using this around them.
Do you think that then it is necessary for other people to be using, let's say other people were using, whatever this means, the suggestive function around an individual, and this is a highly abstract situation, but is that something that would cause a neurotic response?
I think that the effect would be that the person is able to draw upon their own experiences and try to apply this function.
Well, I don't know that it does. I mean, it makes sense. I'm just not sure I agree with it.
Okay.
The way I see it is more like this, which is that the suggestive function is a weakness, and it carries all of the connotations of being a weakness, which is to say there's an erotic response, and there's an enlightenment response, which eventually sort of tries to do what you're saying and calls upon all of the relevant experience. But the enlightened response is certainly not all the time, because people are not enlightened all the time about things in general. Needless to say, not focusing specifically on the suggestive function. This is just sort of a proxy for talking about this issue, because it's a weakness that's usually at the forefront, or sometimes not at the forefront indeed. But I would say that in either case, the sides of this function, which are, there's a neurotic response, there's also a deep lack of awareness of the appropriateness of the response, and this attention to the response that you have, because it's a weakness and because you focus conscious attention to improving it in some sense that leads to an enlightened response. All of these responses all coexist, and they're not neatly differentiable from each other, I think. You know, in the context of an individual, you can imagine that first of all, some people are more well-adjusted than others. End of sentence. Some people simply are more able to deal with the variety of situations and adapt to them that they experience in their lives. But at the same time, you can understand in an individual, right? An individual who appears to be adaptive in one moment could later say that they have experiencing a very great deal of inner distress for some reason that isn't obvious outwardly, or that, I mean, not everyone has the same problems, and they deal with these problems in ways that are not always the same, and the parts of these problems that occupy their conscious thoughts are not always the same, and they may be able to handle the problems in ways that appear very graceful, but in other ways aren't very graceful because there's something else that they're not keeping in mind.
Okay. So the reaction, let's say this type is a certain way, can come out of that slightly and be more enlightened and think more thoroughly in ways that are not necessarily natural, but in general the person acts in line with their expression.
You're saying that in general, the most common mode of expression is lack of awareness?
Well, for the suggestive.
I would endorse that comment, is that the most common mode of expression with the suggestive function is unawareness. But I wouldn't say that's true for the mobilizing, for instance, where some people are indeed not very aware of their mobilizing function. But I think that it's much easier to have the mobilizing function as something very present in their conscious thinking than for the suggestive function, which is much more deeply embedded.
But both functions, technically, both functions are weakness, though. Is that correct?
I think it's a matter of semantics in some sense, because what you're saying is consistent with Augusta's model, yes. As you might know, I think that Augusta, the main thing that does not at all match what I think in Augusta's model is the vulnerable function, the character of the vulnerable function, which is, as you know from our previous discussions, she sees it as a weak spot, it's a source spot, also a weak spot, and I see it as not a source spot at all, it's a blind spot. The function that is closely related to the vulnerable function is, in fact, the mobilizing function, which is reflects the same dimension as the vulnerable function. I think Augusta's writing sorry?
The mobilizing function reflects the same dimension.
The same dimension, yeah, the same domain, right? So in the case of the LSE, then they're both about intuition. They're just the different flavors of intuition, right? The mobilizing function is a little bit awkward in the way that Augusta formulates it. Where for one thing, it's very clear that the mobilizing function is more conscious than the suggestive function. This is true of Augusta's descriptions about it as well. But yes, indeed, she says that this is a super id function, and this is a weak function by extension. I can see what she's talking about, particularly as it relates to the character of the mobilizing function. You can see it in some people, especially in teenagers. Not to pick on teenagers, but especially in teenagers, you can see that. I think it's often in the adolescence that is the formative years where people become more aware, this is this is like level 2, and then sometime later you'll get to level 10 and you'll sort of unlock all the secrets to enlightenment or something like that. But first you have to get to level 2, and it's a lot easier for people to get to level 2 than it is for them to achieve Nibbana and become Arant and whatever that is, assuming that even means anything.
So look, in the alpha, the mobilizing is the FE function, in the ILE, the mobilizing is FE, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and the vulnerable is FI. For the ESE, the mobilizing is NE.
Intuition, yeah.
SEI.
The question, I don't know what you're saying. What are the mobilizing functions for these various types? Yes. Yes. The question you asked is a mobilizing function a weak function? In my view, that's not a very helpful characterization.
Okay.
Because in most individuals that you observe, the mobilizing function isn't going to present itself as a weak function. It's going to present itself as the sort of level 2 realization or the level 3 realization, or something like this, which is as a function which is very present and stubbornly present.
You're saying that it's going to present itself as strong, right? In most people.
I say that it is present.
Okay.
In the way that people are thinking, in people's awareness. So what does that mean, whether or not something is strong or not? Well, first of all, I don't really think in terms of strong and weak functions, not very readily. There are some functions, for instance, the first function is sort of always strong, right? And the fourth function is never strong, or the seventh function is never strong, things like this. This is the way I think of it, right? The first and sixth functions are strong, and the fourth and seventh functions aren't strong. But again, what do you mean by strong? Because this is at odds with the terms of the model that Augusta put forward. And I don't think that those are very useful, right? What is the usefulness of saying that the sixth function is weak? Okay, that's clear enough what the usefulness of saying the sixth function is weak is. What is the usefulness of saying the seventh function is strong? That eludes me.
Well,
does that make sense? Do you follow what I'm saying here? Why I'm making that?
Yeah, because the seventh function is one that you don't really think about often, right? Or, I mean, like, do you think about it? It's just kind of like mixed in with, say...
My view is that you don't think about it. It's basically a blind spot, just like the fourth function.
But you acquire enough information to use it, like if you're presented with a problem that requires it.
No, I don't
would
think
rather
that
not.
That's not the way I see it. The way I see it is that it's not. It's a blind spot like the fourth function.
Okay.
I think
and
that
the end of it?
there's any issues with, like, if you are forced into a situation where you have to use it, I think that's an enormously subtle question.
Okay, let's look at
it's not. I don't think it's really worth thinking about the seventh function in that way. The eighth function is different. But
okay. Okay, so
my view of seeing it, and it might be different from the way that other people see it.
all right, so you would say that the seventh function is the seventh function is just weak, and that's all there is to it, really. Just they just don't really use it.
I don't use the word weak, but yes, this is the way I see it.
You use the terminology blind spot.
Yeah.
Okay.